This is the high-level video on arrays and array lists for Unit 2. So the first thing is, what is an array? So an array has certain properties. So it can, instead of having, say, an integer, which can only hold one numerical value, so you can int I equals 1, you can have multiple values take up multiple spots in memory. So you have one chunk of memory that's declared when the array is initialized that will store some number of integer variables. So you would have maybe an array of integers that can store the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That'll just be the contents of the array. But how do we store that in a variable in Java? So the way that you would do that is you need to first declare it. So arrays are declared in Java by first having the type. So let's say we have an int, and then you use the left and right square brackets to indicate that it's an array. And this is also recursive. So you can have an int array of ints. You just have another square bracket, and now it's an integer array of integer arrays. So we have int, let's say have one single array, int numbers. So now it's declared and we have a variable, but currently that variable stores a null value, and we need to initialize it. There's two different ways that we can do that. The first way is to just initialize it by not giving it any values, but just declaring a spot in memory or a certain amount of cells in memory that will be available to store numbers or store whatever variable the array's type is. So you do this by saying numbers equals new, and then it's a new type of the array. So it would be new int, and in these square brackets, instead of leaving them blank, you have the number of elements that the array can hold. And because arrays take up a chunk of memory, they're reserved when they're initialized. So they can't be changed. You can't have 5 elements in an array and then have 6 elements in an array. Once it's initialized, it's permanent. So you'd have int 5. That's the first way. The second way is to have it so that the numbers variable would be initialized with its contents. So you'd have numbers equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we have a initialized array. So what can we do with that? Of course we can see the values and we can access them. And that's why they're powerful, is that you can access the elements in the array and you can change them, even though you can't change the lengths of it. So by using the square brackets again, and we do the index, so say I wanted the 0th index of numbers, that would be equal, in our example, to 1. And then you can even change the value at a certain index by using the equal sign, and it behaves just like a variable. So you could have numbers 0 equals 5, and then that changes the array contents to be 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's what basics of just what an array is. And then there's also this thing called an array list. So an array list is a bit like an array, however, it's dynamically sized. So it's not initialized with its size already, and it can change. You can add elements to it, you can remove elements to it, and every element you remove and add is dynamically changing its size. This is because array lists don't take up one chunk of memory. They take up a chunk of memory. Initially, they have one element, and in that element, they have a pointer to the next element. So instead of being like the previous example of you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's just the integer values, you would have 1, and that would point to 2, and that would point to 3, and so on. So just by having the variable, it's in a structure that has a pointer to the next one. Array lists can, instead of being initialized by their size, they're just initialized like a class, because they're just regular class, and they can only hold classes as well, because they need to be able to point. And integers have different sizes, but all classes have the same size. So you would declare it like array list, and you would have the name of the variable. So array list AL, and that's the basics of it. But you need also to have the type as well. That's not only is the type in the initialization, the type is also in the name of the class. So instead of having array list of int, I need to have integer because it can only hold classes. So array list integer AL equals new array list integer, and then just give it an empty constructor. And AL cannot have index. You can't do the square brackets because it's a class. It needs to be manipulated with methods, and there's a few of these methods. So you have the class array list, and some of the just basic methods are the .add, which takes an index, and element. And E just represents whatever class it's initialized with. So in the previous example, E would change to integer. So it would be a capital I integer element. And this inserts the element at some index of the array so that all the elements after that index are shifted one to the right. And you can also, instead of having an index, you can just by default append it to the end of the array. So you do .add element. There's also the .remove, which just takes the index of the particular object in the array, and it'll delete it, and it'll move every other element succeeding it to the left. And then finally, you have .size, which just returns the amount of elements in the array. So that's just the basics of arrays and array lists in Java. And there, of course, array lists are actually more used now because of the dynamic sizing. It just gives an advantage. Even though it's technically more inefficient and takes up more computing resources, because our computers have progressed so much, it has enabled us to use array lists and have the benefits of dynamic sizing and sort of safety as well, of being in a class rather than being just raw variables in memory.